This is my friend, Brother Euless Lilly, the best tenor singer these parts has ever produced, and we've had some good ones. I'd give you a little pitch right here if you'd give us a little tenor.
Well,
Do-me-do-so-do.
Can't sing now. I got bronchitis. I always use a pitch pipe, for I sang 98% of my singing was without music. In the primitive Baptist style.
Yeah.
I love that.
You have a hymnal in your pocket there, right?
No.
Don't have one.
But I like that kind of singing, that without music. And I like that doctrine when I was a little boy. And then I got to be a big boy, and I still like it.
Yeah.
It kind of a part of me.
You remember Stinking Jim, don't you? He had a little bit of odor to him, but the only thing he had to take it off was homemade soap, and it kind of itched the skin, so he didn't use much of it. Stinking Jim. Kenny Clyde, that was my uncle. He was born in 1889, and he was supposed to die right away. He just couldn't hold his food down or anything, had dyspepsia. Now, dyspepsia is a stomach disorder, and so they picked out a place to bury him and made a cemetery there. And he went ahead, since he was such a small child, he didn't know that there's anything wrong with him, and he just went ahead and lived. If he'd have been a big person, he'd have knew that he was sick, and he'd have worried himself to death, see? And so since he went ahead and lived like that, eventually his mother died, and they put her in there. And eventually his daddy died, and they put him there beside his mother. And then one of his brothers and his wife died, and they put him in there. Another one of his brothers died, and they put him in there. This is 1934 that they buried him. Then after a while, my daddy died, and they put him in there. And my mama put her in there. And last of all, Skinny Clyde died. And instead of being skinny, they called him Pusley-Gutted Clyde. And he weighed 240 pounds, about as big as I am, I guess. But they used to be Skinny Clyde, that's what they called him. And he told me that he used to work in Beckley, and it's 26 miles from Beckley to here. And he'd work at 5 o'clock in Beckley on Saturday evening, walk home to Camp Creek at night, and tend a little dance and dance some for him. He was so skinny, he was a regular contortionist, and he could do every kind of a step in the world. And he would dance for him till way up towards the morning hours, and then go home and spend the night and walk back to Beckley on Sunday evening. People nowadays don't have boils like they used to. When I was a kid, it was nothing uncommon to see a person with boils all over him. Even old righteous Job in the Bible, he had his share of the boils, you know. And they would peel that hard shell off of the egg and dump the contents out, and that'd leave you a little thin membrane on there, and you put it on top of the bowl, and it would draw up when it dried and draw that core out of there and cause it to burst itself. And then that was one way of getting rid of it. Another one was oatmeal, just plain old oatmeal that you eat. Just pour water on it and mix a kind of a paste out of it and put it on there, and it would do the same thing. It would dry up and draw it out. And then there was another remedy. You could take white plantain. It grows in very poor ground, and you bruise it. Just put it in your hand or something and strike a stick or a rock, and it would secrete a juice, kind of like plasma or something like that. And you put that on there, and it was good for a boil. It was also good for a sore. if you had fall sores on you or something like that, or if you had diarrhea, you could take that white plantain and bruise it and put it down in some hot water and get a tea out of it and drink it, and it would draw your stomach up and cut those glands out from secreting all that stuff. It made your bowels want to run off, and it would actually help you. Blackberries. I hated blackberries with a passion because the cows would go through there and scratch their udder, and then when you go to milk them, there was a big sore, and when you squeezed that, they'd kick a milk bucket out of your hand, and set off a chain reaction. But a man told me to get some of that and give to her, and I did, and it was in the winter time, and I couldn't find any good blackberries, so I went to this old man's house that had carried that coal all that distance, and he had some blackberries that was 18 years old, and they told me how old he was, and the reason they knew how old he were because they canned him the year he went to the pen, and they opened them when he came back and gave me some of them, so they knew the age of them right away. And but that fixed the diarrhea up on her. Now, there is another good remedy that's growing out there, and a lot of people call it jewel weed. If you would buy it, oh, you probably got some of these flowers. Impatiens. That's another blowed up name for it, but you get the wild ones out here in the wild, and they always grow in a rich, succulent soil, and you just give them a squeeze and the water will run out of them, and they're good for just about anything that ails you. If you got gnats are biting you, eating you up, or if you got abrasions on you, get you some of that juice out of those and put on you, and I just about guarantee it to fix you right up. Confederate soldiers and Yankee soldiers that met up here on top of this hill, and they just pulled their guns and shot it out. And one of the bullets went through a Yankee soldier's testicle and went on over and hit a little old farm girl over there that was going out to spring to get a bucket of water, and carried it on over there and hit her and impregnated her, and she bore a child, and they named him Booge Harmon. Grandpa, there's a woman lived right on up the road up here. Us kids would go by and she couldn't tell time, and we'd say, "Hey, Dory." She'd come and open the window and look down the railroad at us, and we'd say, "What time is it?" And she'd say, "One hand's toward the chicken house and the other's toward the creek." She had a baby one time and it got sick, and she left it with Miss Russell, who lived right over there where that syringo bush is. That's a mock orange in today's society. And she looked at that thing, and it was sick and not behaving well, and so she put it off there with Miss Russell. And Miss Russell, she give that thing everything she could give it. She'd give it sugar tits and all this stuff. Did you ever see a sugar tit? Why, you take a piece of sackcloth that sugar used to come in and put about a teaspoonful of sugar in there and tie a string around it real tight, and it'll look like an acorn, and a baby will suck it until he's sucked all that. Oftentimes he quits crying and goes to sleep before he gets done sucking, but evidently this must have had a tough suck button to suck, and so this old Miss Russell told that woman, Dory, said, "That kid of yours said you took so long to go down there. Well, it's 2.5 miles from here to Camp Creek and 2.5 back, and you walk all that, you walked a pretty good distance." And she said that she got that baby up, said, "Well, the thing to do is to grind the onion up and then mash it and get the juice out of it and put some sugar in it," and said it'll stop any baby from crying. And so after that happened, Miss Russell always squeezed some onion juice out. Crumpecker was a sheriff here. Isn't that an odd name? There's a hill over here, Crumpecker Hill. 4-lane hard road there now. Used to be just a little wiggly lane across that. And so I was supposed to go over to Bluefield, and the conservation officer was going to work with me. I had a flat tire, and I just couldn't get no farther to save my neck. And this conservation officer called and wanted to know where I was. And I told him I was on Crumpecker Hill. We had lady radio operators then. They didn't know nothing about these names up here. Like one of them over was Fussy Creek. Now, wasn't that a name? And the boss would call me every time and say, there ain't no such place as Fussy Creek. I said, well, yeah, it's on the map. All you got to do is look it up. And but anyhow, it flabbergasted her when I said Crumpecker Hill. And she come back again and said, would you repeat that? I said Crumpecker Hill. So then it was time for her to hand that message over. That conservation officer was standing by in Bluefield. And she said, at 434, he's on his way to Bluefield. But they were just petite little girls, and they blushed more than they do now. The Bible, there's scripture in the Bible, I can't think of it right offhand, but it says that people have lost their blush, and they have. Oh, I hear people on radio and television now talking and using what I call a real filthy language. And back when I was a kid, nobody talked that way. I didn't talk to my mommy about anything. For instance, somebody might have a gas problem or something like that, and I wouldn't tell Ma or talk to Ma about it or anything. We had her blush. We just didn't talk filthy like that. We had a cow one time that was really an efficient cow. Old Buttercup, she was good for butter, and I guess she probably saved a many person's life during that depression to keep them from starving to death. But this one here was a money-making cow. The next one we got, she was a black cow. Never did like black cows, don't know why. You feed a black cow green grass, she gives white milk and white butter. You give a yellow cow green grass, she gives white milk and yellow butter. Just never did know that. We didn't like her butter. It was too pale. But anyhow, it had the same fat content to it that the other did. And so we were, Dad was one day calculating how valuable that cow was. She'd have a calf every year, and we'd grow the calf up, and the calf would bring about $25, which was a big chunk of money for those days. And we didn't have to feed her any, so we didn't have to discount that. You see, she sucked herself, and she'd eat this grass, and her body would convert it into milk, and then she would just suck the milk, and it would convert it back. And so it's this perpetual motion. We just never did have to spend anything on her. Everything was profit. Never had such a cow set in life. And Dad had a collar made for her to go around her to keep her from eating too much. He's afraid she might die from overeating. What's they call that, bulimia now or something like that? Well, on this side over here was the set we come from, and you get over there, and it was the groundhog lilies. You know any groundhog lilies?
This one that I was telling you about lived 100 years old, died on his birthday. That's a groundhog's bunch of lilies.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, for some reason or other, they didn't want to be called groundhog. It was beloved their dignity and so on, and I knew a Tom Lilly who lived at Pipestem. Gravelly Point's where he lived on. That's the road that goes down to Bull Falls from Pipestem. And he had a boy that got a job and was working with me. And one day he said, "What set of lilies are you out of?" And I really didn't know, but I just made a rough guess and said, "I'm out of the groundhog lilies." He said, "That's what I'm out of," and he grinned great big. But they didn't like for you to call him a groundhog. One of them killed a fellow because he called him a groundhog. I don't know a whole lot to tell you about the buckwheat lilies.
One was named Grinning Jim.
Grinning Jim, right. Grinning Jim had a boy that lived at Flat Top, and he always was grinning. And one of them went possum hunting one time, and the dog treed a possum, and he couldn't get it to come down. It had no limbs on it so he could hold to and get up there to it. And so they named him Grinning Jim. And the reason for the Grinning Jim was that he just sat there and grinned at that possum until the possum got tired of it and come down out of there. So that's where the possum gets his grin, off of Grinning Jim. There used to be a Murphy store in Princeton, and I think every other little town had one of them. The most wonderful store that's ever been. You could get anything that you wanted in there. If you had a dime, if you didn't, some of them would buy it for you. And there was an old man named Blind Alfred Reed that would sit outside the door, and he had a guitar. Probably got it from selling seeds. And on this guitar was mounted a can that would be about like one that you'd get tuna in or something. And he'd play a tune, and somebody that had a soft spot in their heart would come up and drop a nickel or a quarter one in that. And the first thing you know, he'd have a cup full of coins, and he'd go somewhere and empty him down his boot top or somewhere, I guess. And people would pitch in and contribute to the cause, and he'd grin about it and come back next week, and he'd teach you how to play music. Pretty good at it. He played the fiddle too. He was a good one, boy. He'd saw that thing. He wasn't a moneyed man. God bless his soul, but I do believe that he was a soul winner.